Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided. This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy and other Eagan community television programming is supported by Thomson Reuters, makers of Westlawn Next and based in Eagan. Through Westlawn Next and other innovative online services, Thomson Reuters is the world's leading source of intelligent information for businesses and professionals. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And by U.S. Federal Credit Union, the member-owned financial institution offering service, value, and experience you can trust to the greater Twin Cities community.
Welcome back. Access to Democracy with you once again. Alan Miller with you once again, and it's always fun to have a new guest. And a particularly interesting guest today, Roxanne Meshar, and welcome.
Thank you.
Roxanne has a really interesting background. She's an author, she's a theologian, but she started out in the corporate world. Now tell me, how does somebody go from the corporate world of the vultures to walking with God?
It's a good question. I would say, like most people, I started from college working in corporate environment. I worked at Sears actually and worked there for 10 years. Did, I would say, just about everything you could ever think to do at Sears. Over the time I was there, from driving forklifts and working in stores to working in the region, and ended up after 10 years on the 54th floor of the Sears Tower in the mergers and acquisitions department.
In Chicago.
Yes, in Chicago. And then I left there and I went to work at Spiegel in the marketing department, Spiegel Catalog, also in Chicago. And that still wasn't quite what I thought I ought to be doing, so I left there and started my own consulting business for companies in the western suburbs of Chicago. So companies at the time, Meritech, which became SBC or AT&T. Other companies like McDonald's was a pretty big client of mine, and product development there. And food product companies like Kraft, and some marketing companies like Leo Burnett, advertising companies,
but you still weren't satisfied.
Exactly. So after 10 years of doing that, my children...
You're not old enough to have done all those things. I want to start by saying that.
Thank you. But I am. But my children weren't children anymore. My kids were one out of college, one in college, and I decided that I looked at the 4 cars in the driveway in the big house in Chicago one day and said, my life cannot be about this. You know, there has to be more to life than this. And a friend of mine had said, Roxanne, why don't you think of studying theology? And when she said it, it was kind of like getting hit over the head with a brick, a 2x4. I thought, that's it. That's what I should be doing. What I would do with that, I wasn't sure, coming from a business environment, but I did. I went to one of the largest Roman Catholic seminaries, because that's my tradition that I come out of, in Chicago, adjacent to the University of Chicago. And I started out as a student at large, really going a little deeper to find out what I ought to be doing with my life, and how the values of the tradition I was raised in maybe fit my values as an adult, and where did I really want to spend my time and energy. And then I was invited to get my Master's of Divinity there, so I did. And of course, in the Catholic tradition, men who get their Masters of Divinity are ordained, but women are not. So we work in other areas.
That.
Yes. So anyway, so I did finish that, but one thing I knew for sure, I wasn't going to work in a parish. I didn't want to work in a parish. I knew what PTA in a school was like, and that was not for me. So of course, life being what it is, you can imagine when I graduated where I ended up, in fact, working in a parish here in Minnesota. And I had interviewed here really for this job thinking they would hire a pastoral associate who had experience working in a parish, and it wasn't me, and it was a good interview experience to go back and interview, do my second interview for the PhD program at the University of Chicago. But in fact, I was offered the job and I took it. So.
And in fact, you have gotten your doctorate.
Yes, since then, yes. I did go back. I got my doctorate and used what I learned there to go back. Well, after I was working in the parish, I also for a while both taught at the University of St. Thomas theology. I was invited to teach there a couple years after working at as a pastoral associate. But you can't do both, and the one job is a 60-hour-a-week job, and as you know, you're a professor, so trying to do full-time work and be a professor, pretty hard.
Professor Meshar was 10 years at St. Thomas.
Almost 10 years, yeah, nearly 10 years. So.
And during that time, had the time to write 4 books?
Yes, I did, and I have a blog as well, Inter-Pacific, which has about 500 posts on it. But
yeah, what's the genesis of Inter-Pacific? It's a very interesting blog.
Yes, Inter-Pacific is kind of musings on things that are going on in the world, what's happening politically, economically, but also
what can women do to resist patriarchy?
What can women do to resist patriarchy? Exactly. So that's one of the latest posts on there. And how can people recognize patriarchy when they see it, and what steps can we take to help eliminate patriarchy so that everybody has equal access and everybody gets equal advantages, let's put it that way. But anyway, to that point, so 4 books. So one of them is a gift for you today, which is God is Not Zeus, and I'll leave that with you.
Oh,
and there's a
thank you.
bookmark inside and a little note
Thank
inside
you.
for you.
God is Not Zeus.
Yeah.
And speaking of God, I thank you.
You're welcome.
Was that the first one?
No, that wasn't the first one. See, the first one is The Political Nature of Doctrine, and I try to...
We'll bring that up.
Okay. I try to do the title so that people get an education. So The Political Nature of Doctrine, which interpretation, who benefits, who decides. So even now, if you do not read that book, you have some idea of what's going on with that book. So
Now, you describe yourself as a systematic theologian. That's theology in the eyes of civil justice?
it is for me. I'll explain that term. So a systematic theologian is a theologian and a philosopher are very similar. So a philosopher and a theologian both are dealing with what is the deeper meaning of life, why the bigger questions, why are we here?
So do you sit on a mountaintop someplace and
No, you do this in conversation with many people. But a theologian differs from a philosopher because we come out of a stance of faith. We already believe that God exists, if you will. So similar questions, different vantage points in terms of how we address them. And then a systematic theologian differs from like a historical theologian. So we deal with a whole system of thought or a system of values, if you will, that have to be consistently applied to every question we address. So in my case, the set of values that I use are social equity or social justice, common good is one of the key values. So everything that I consider goes through that lens. Is it working for the common good? And so that's my set of values. But I also come
you are involved in some charitable organizations.
Yeah, I am involved.
Mary Pence and among others. And
So one of the ways that I can act those values out in my real life is through organizations like Mary's Pence, which aren't charities per se, but they are organizations that work for social change. And in the case of Mary's Pence, they use Aspera
or social
funds.
justice as well.
Or social justice as well. but they use Aspera funds in this case. It's not micro-lending, but it's lending pools for women in Central and South America that they govern themselves. So they decide who gets the funds and how much. And I think you've had Catherine Voitin on the show before. She's the director of Mary's Pence, to explain how that works. But it's getting to the underlying causes of poverty. The point is, you don't want just charity because the cause is not solved and the person still has to come back for help when the money runs out. You want to do something that changes the underlying
that person to
problem.
Get on their own 2 feet.
Yes.
And people who accept charity, for the most part, don't want it. They would like to be self-sufficient.
Exactly. So in every issue that comes up, systematic theologians will look for the underlying cause, and then what are the set of values that best will address that? So how might we work for that? So immigration's a big topic for today, and there's a lot of discussion around that with the President's talk. But for myself, I look and say, well, there's a big gap in the conversation. Nobody is asking, why are migrants coming this way north in the first place? What's causing the movement north? And when I was in Juarez, working with people in the barrios there, I sat one evening with a young couple and an 18-month-old who were headed out to come into the United States illegally the following day through the desert. Young couple, I'm going to say maybe 22, 23 years old, 18-month-old little girl. And I asked them, what would ever make you take this little child through the desert? You may not come out alive on the other side. Likely, it's a huge risk. And he didn't even hesitate. He looked at me and he said, if we stay here, we starve. So people migrate because there's a real need not to get a 3-car garage, not to just improve their housing size. They migrate particularly from South and Central America to avoid hunger. And
the
so
President took a very big step yesterday in an executive order which should legalize or at least permanentize perhaps as many as 5 million of these people.
Right, but the bigger question is, how can we solve? People don't want to move. They want to stay where their families are. You wouldn't move unless you had to. It's a huge risk to move from continent to continent.
With the weather
so
this
how
month,
do we,
you don't have to tempt me too much.
But how can we look at the underlying cause and make some changes there so people don't need to come north in the first place? They can stay where their homes and their farms and things are.
So what does God is not Zeus focus on? And maybe we can bring up that cover also. What does it focus on?
God is not Zeus is really written for Christians and Catholics too, because we live in a culture where God is very much like Zeus and portrayed like Zeus. Judgmental, out there,
especially
up in the clouds.
In the Old Testament.
Especially in the Old Testament, although not always.
He was a tough guy.
So that book is about how do we look at what the Christian tradition really says about who and what God might be like, and it likely is not the God of Greek philosophy, likely not Zeus. And the reason it's important is because when we have this idea in our heads that God is out there, up there, not concerned with me personally and not within the world and within other human beings, then we treat the world differently and we treat ourselves differently because God is so far away and so distant. So that's one of the reasons I wrote that book and other things in there as well.
Now, more Roman than Catholic, and maybe we can bring that cover up also. What does that mean?
More Roman than Catholic is, again, for Catholic communities to take a good look at what are their values. And we have, as a Roman tradition, pulled in things from many cultures, Hebrew culture originally, Greek culture, many of the cultures around the Mediterranean early on in Christianity, including Roman culture. And there's some good things there, but some not so good things. There's a lot of understanding of the world as hierarchical or one-way communication or mandating things which are out of the Roman tradition but may not serve Catholicism best and hasn't always been part of the Catholic tradition. So highlighting some of the things that we carry in our baggage as Roman Catholics, which may or may not work as well for us now as they did early on or at one point in time. So that's the purpose of that book.
And the fourth book?
The fourth book
Living
is
a Luxury
Living
Life.
a Luxury Life, and that's my favorite book because that takes really the learning from the other books and puts them into how you address this in your everyday life. So it's how to live life luxuriously on the inside, but more simply on the outside. So how we can divert our energy with all kinds of things and clutter and stuff and junk that saps our energy and drains us and stops us from living the best life that we could. And living a luxury life is kind of a little meditation, as well as there's lots of white space there for readers to write their
So
own
we're
comments
talking
in.
about the inner self.
The inner self. And so it's very fun. And what came out of that book also is a series of retreats I do called Fill Your Life with Fabulous.
Fill your life with fabulous.
Fabulous. So our time is limited. We don't know how much time we're going to have. I could get hit by a truck on the way home tonight. This might be the last few hours I have in my life.
Well, let's say God forbid.
Let's say God
In your
forbid.
case.
Inshallah. Let's say that if I was Muslim. Anyway, but why not make sure then that every minute of my time is spent using my gifts and doing what is really fabulous in my life, and that's relationships, that's things, that's where we spend our time. And I started that whole...
Sort of like living each day to the fullest.
Yes, exactly.
Because there are no guarantees.
Yes, and I started by spending a year, actually the year after I got my doctorate, taking negative things out of my life, really editing my life in a big way, wherever I found negative things that made me stop and say, I can't wait till that's over. If that's what my feeling was, then it shouldn't be on my calendar, it shouldn't be in my life, whether it was people or things, whatever. And then I went from there to, well, if I can take and edit negative and neutral things, why shouldn't I make sure that only fabulous things go on my calendar? Why shouldn't I wake up every morning and say, I cannot wait for everything that's happening on my calendar today? There you go. There's
It's a great
living.
individual philosophy.
Yeah. And it helps people to use their gifts.
Now, we have something which I think is very exciting for the Catholic Church, was that we have a new Pope, Francis. I actually call him Frank because we're on that sort of a basis. But the Pope is stepping forward with a lot of innovations. And people are really, for instance, he said, why shouldn't gays get married? Which shocked half the Curia, maybe 90% of the Curia. The church has been known as being very conservative. This Pope has been always a man of the people. I mean, he shuns anything that's showy. He wouldn't live in the former Pope's residence. He just wants a simple place. So obviously he's a man of the people. How do you approach now your view of the church with this new Pope, and do you think he will be able to sustain his beliefs and remold the church?
Those are very good questions, and I think Francis is a good model for someone who knows what his values are and lives out of those values. And for him, that does include social change or social justice, and looking at his background and where he comes out of.
He certainly worries about poverty and impoverished people, and he even made a point of talking about those who have so much that they can't possibly enjoy it, and how much is too much, as opposed to people who are really struggling to exist.
Who do you think should answer that question, how much is too much? Who gets to decide how much is too much?
Well, obviously not the Koch brothers, but for sure. And,
You want to know what I think?
well,
I think the person who doesn't eat today gets to decide how much is too much. That's what I
that's
think.
an interesting approach to it, yeah.
So, but your question reminds me a little bit of a question I got not too long ago along similar lines. what do I think Pope Francis is going to do about poverty in the world, and what kind of effect do I think he will have? And immediately my response was, and it still is to the Catholic community, that's the wrong question. The question is, what are we going to do about poverty? That's the question. What am I doing about it today?
Well, that's really so important, though, because it is a question of not one individual and what that individual can be an inspiration.
Mm-hmm. You can model great
Martin
values.
Luther King was an inspiration for many things.
Yes, exactly.
Apparently had a darker side. Jack Kennedy was an inspiration for many things. And this Pope, I think, will be an inspiration for many things if he can sustain himself and
that's the hope, yeah.
And perhaps remodel the church in that regard.
But the community has to want that to happen, and there has to be some political will that are within the community who are willing to say, these are our values, this is what we stand for, and this is how we're going to make that happen.
You know, as mankind has gone through different innovations, I would call this the time of greed. Yeah. Because that's how I look at what's happening in not only our society, but in societies in general now. We have really robber barons who are worse than the robber barons of the 1800s, who have so much, and not only that, they've become oligarchs. They want to control the society and deprive people of really just a meager existence, and there's something so wrong with that in my mind.
And what it's doing to the planet as well, not to mention human beings. And we're often surprised, you know, I come out of an economics background as well, and we are so surprised that, you know, how could poverty be such a major feature or symptom of unregulated capitalism, and yet that's not a symptom, that's not a bug, that's a feature, as Eve Smith would say from Naked Capitalism. That is the reason unregulated capitalism ends up with oligarchs and a huge wealth transfer from the many to the few. I mean, it's designed that way, it's built in.
Do you think we will see women in the pulpit?
I think we see in Christianity right now many women in the pulpit. In Roman Catholicism, that remains to be seen. If that change will happen in my lifetime or not, I don't know. But
I mean, popes used to be married up until the 1300s.
Absolutely, and cardinals didn't have to be ordained clergy in order to be cardinals, so that's part of canon law. And celibacy, you're right, came later in the game, and so it's not the way things were initially. So there's many opportunities in the early church we know had women apostles and women who headed up house churches. So that's part of our tradition and part of our background.
There was an article in the paper today where the local church, the St. Paul diocese, was talking about filing bankruptcy because not only of pedophile priests, but of other things. And I thought, well, the church has so many holdings and so many possessions. Why would they possibly want to file bankruptcy? And reading into the story, one of the reasons is that that would put settlements in some of these pedophile cases in the hands of a bankruptcy judge, as opposed to going to court. And to me, that was a terrible, terrible reason. That is really abdicating responsibility completely.
It is.
I mean, there's a problem, face up to it, and let's meet it head on.
And here's a community that's allowing that to happen. So while the responsibility in part resides with the leaders of the community, the responsibility, on the other hand, also resides with the community itself, who allows that to go on and allows that to happen without handling things in a more responsible manner.
This is a very conservative diocese in this area. For instance, they want to toughen things up on people getting annulments, which is contrary to the Pope, who would give the sacraments to people who have had annulments and things like that. How do those things get reconciled?
Well, each diocese, each bishop is responsible unto himself. So he can look to advice, to Rome for advice, but he's not required to take it. Although I would beg to differ with your comment that it's a conservative diocese. It may be in terms of leadership over from time to time, although we've had leaders in the past in this diocese who were pretty involved in social change and social equity. And the community here is quite involved in social justice and social change. So we've done a lot of work.
But I don't see it from the leader, at least from my viewpoint.
Correct. But the community itself has done a lot of work for affordable housing and a lot of work for social justice in St. Paul and Minneapolis, and this community benefits from that. So
There's so much more that I want to discuss with you, and we're down to 2.5 minutes.
Oh my goodness.
So it goes fast.
It goes fast.
Let's tell us where you can get your books.
Oh, you can get them on Barnes & Noble, you can get them at Amazon.com, you can certainly go to Lulu Publishing and order them there. And I would love it if people would, so that's nice.
Maybe we can stimulate some sales here,
should be
because we
good.
have some stimulating books here. And
So thank you, yes.
certainly. We talked about annulments. The Archdiocese is going through budget cuts and cutting staff.
Yeah.
And talking bankruptcy, which to me is just unheard of. Although some have gone into bankruptcy, but they've been hit with tremendous verdicts in these pedophile priest cases.
But I think we have to hold leaders accountable, and I think the community, hopefully coming out of this, will realize that responsibility without accountability is problematic, and to allow the community to make sure that leaders are accountable and that things are transparent and that we are inclusive. So those would be
And the Pope certainly is doing everything I think that he can as a new Pope to really change things. In fact, he just removed a cardinal from a position, I think with the Curia Bank or whatever it was. Yeah, and obviously is making his mark.
On the other hand, he is formed and comes out of that same structure that doesn't have accountability and doesn't force responsibility. So he, in some ways, will have to work against his own training, and that's a very difficult road to
But yours, in your
move
own
through.
way, has become a voice which is heard and should be heard in terms of approaching your church with a very realistic and logical approach, and not being afraid to question things that you think are wrong.
Yeah, absolutely.
And would that there would be many, many more people in not just the Catholic Church, but others who profess different religions to do the same. And we've been talking with Roxanne Meshar, not long enough, so I think we have to come back again
I think so too. Yeah.
and continue this
Like
discussion.
we never got to, does God exist, and how do you answer
Thank-
that question?
Thank
Yeah.
you so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me, Ellen.